Hello, everyone. We're very excited to welcome you today to our book talk with Dr. Stephen Wertheim, Tomorrow, the World, the Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy. Dr. Stuart Gottlieb is going to serve as our moderator today, and let me tell you a little bit about him. He is an adjunct professor of international affairs and public policy here at SIPA, and he's been teaching here since 2003. Prior to that, he was a foreign policy advisor and speechwriter in the U.S. Senate for 5 years. Since 2003, he has been teaching SIPA's main American foreign policy course, and he has won multiple teaching awards for this. Currently, he is working on a book on American foreign policy for Yale University Press entitled Experimental Power, The Rise and Role of America in World Affairs. Stuart holds a PhD in international relations from here at Columbia, and he's a longtime contributing member to the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. Stuart, please take it away.
Thank you, Ingrid. Once again, an introduction that would make my mother happy. So I appreciate that. Thanks to everybody for coming. My friend Corona wants to apologize for us not being able to do this in person, but hopefully we'll be able to see you all in person someday soon. I want to thank everyone else for being here, especially Stephen Wertheim. We've worked together on other panels before, so I'm thrilled to be back with Stephen on a panel. I'm going to just give a brief intro to Stephen. He's going to then speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then I'll jump back in for a little back and forth with our author. We might also be joined by Professor Bob Jervis for some interaction with Stephen as well, we'll see. And we'll make sure we have plenty of time to hear from our valued members of the audience today. Stephen Wertheim is Deputy Director of Research and Policy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He specializes in U.S. foreign relations and international order, particularly from the 19th century to the present. In addition to his new book, he has articles that have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, The Nation, New York Review of Books, New York Times, Washington Post, among others. He was previously a research scholar at Saltzman Institute that's hosting this event, and a visiting assistant professor of history at Columbia, where he earned his PhD. In his widely acclaimed new book, Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, with a beautiful dust jacket, by the way, Dr. Wertheim offers a superb addition to our understanding of one of the most important periods, not just in American history, but in world history. And that's the U.S. decision very early on during World War II to assume a massive and highly militarized permanent role in the world. I'll turn it over to Stephen to pick it up from here, and I'll see you all on the other side.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart, for that introduction, and Ingrid for organizing this panel today. I'm delighted to have a chance to discuss the book. I must say that, Stuart, you threw me for a loop by introducing your stuffed Corona into the equation. I think we'll recover, though, and it was already a positive development to see it contrasted with the book jacket. I'm grateful for that. So my book poses an almost absurdly simple question. Why did the United States adopt military dominance as the fundamental objective of its role in the world? When did it first embrace global supremacy as its objective? And it's more than that, it's an axiom. It is the premise from which much foreign policy debate begins. I think we know that this wasn't always the case. Armed primacy wasn't a goal articulated by George Washington or John Quincy Adams. So at some point between then and now, American officials and intellectuals must have made a decision for dominance and turned it into an axiomatic position in American politics. And when I ask audiences when they think this moment of rupture came, I won't do that here in our virtual environment, but I get a remarkably wide range of dates. 1898, World War I, the 1940s, any part of the 1940s, even the 1990s. That range, I think, is a rather striking fact in and of itself. So I want to propose that there was an identifiable moment of decision, and it came before the attack on Pearl Harbor put the United States into the Second World War. If that's so, perhaps it makes sense why the United States remains reflexively committed to military dominance in our own time, because military dominance comes out of its best moment as a nation, World War II, the crucible of the modern United States. Now, first, though, it would be fair to ask how I could claim that scholars haven't really squarely posed the question of how the United States made the decision for dominance. I would submit that historians and political scientists have developed two distinct ways of avoiding or deflecting this question. One group of scholars interprets the history in terms of the victory of internationalism in a long-standing struggle against isolationism. The idea is that the United States, throughout its history, oscillated between these two motive forces before internationalism finally triumphed. This is also a very popular narrative among the educated public and the broad public. The problem is that this story is teleological. It acts as if certain people, the internationalists, favored American global supremacy all along. They just needed to sweep the isolationists out of the way. In fact, few self-described internationalists prior to World War II wanted the United States to be politically and militarily preeminent. What made them internationalists was their desire to transcend power politics. For most of American history, that's what American leaders said they wanted. They said they hoped that peaceful intercourse could supplant the reign of force. The circulation of goods, ideas, people would give expression to the harmony latent among nations and prevent the resort to war. From this perspective, armed supremacy looked unnecessary at best and imperialistic at worst. And then the category of isolationism makes even less sense to describe any group of Americans. Almost no one throughout American history has described him or herself as an isolationist. The term is an epithet, and not only that, it wasn't even used with any regularity before the 1930s. Now, there's a second camp of scholars who would be nodding along to what I've said so far. They reject the anti-isolationist narrative. These scholars dismiss isolationism as a myth and argue that the United States global superpowering. Didn't the United States expand constantly, whether driven by the material dynamics of capitalism, the ideology of exceptionalism, or both, or something else? And, maybe that is true. But if anything, such a framework gets us farther away from the question of how American foreign policy elites acquired the will to lead the world politically and militarily. It assumes that intentions and conceptions didn't much matter. This view ignores how reluctant American policymakers said they were to undertake what they construed as entanglements in Europe and Asia. The United States possessed the largest economy of any nation by 1870. But decade after decade, America's economic supremacy didn't seem to imply a need for military supremacy. Only a rupture, I think, would change this state of affairs. That rupture had not arrived in 1939 when President Franklin Roosevelt greeted Lord Lothian at the White House. Lothian was soon to be Britain's ambassador to the United States, and he told the American president that Anglo-Saxon civilization, in his words, needed a new guardian. The United States had to take the torch of world leadership from Great Britain. FDR wasn't having it. He mocked Lothian, he got mad, and told him to toughen up. What the British need today is a good stiff grog, Roosevelt said. So the president of the United States preferred to let the British lead the world politically and militarily. He didn't even suggest that, well, perhaps the day would come when America might take the lead. He simply showed no interest. And FDR was typical of Americans before him. Almost no one before 1940 had imagined that the United States could or should emerge anytime soon as the world's preeminent power that permanently projected its military across the globe. The world already had a leader in Great Britain, and American elites either accepted British leadership by the early part of the 20th century, or they doubted that the world needed any armed superpower whatsoever. So when World War II began in Europe, few Americans saw a good reason to enter, much less to take up arms after the war. In the State Department, a small group of post-war planners gathered at the beginning of 1940, and they all agreed that the United States would surely make no military commitments beyond its own hemisphere. The real action, however, came just outside the state, in the Council on Foreign Relations and other places and universities and think tanks. But the CFR was then 20 years old and already an important institution. Just 2 weeks after the war began in Europe, leaders of the council lined up funding with the Rockefeller Foundation and went to the State Department to volunteer to conduct long-range planning that the short-staffed department couldn't undertake. The State Department readily agreed. And the Council on Foreign Relations gathered a group of about 100 post-war planners. Gives us a sense of the US foreign policy elite at the time. It included, for example, the Army's top planner, General George V. Strong, future CIA Director Allen Dulles. One group was helmed by both the leading Keynesian economists in the United States, Alvin Hansen of Harvard, and his neoclassical rival, Jacob Viner of Chicago. After Pearl Harbor, the council planners, most of them, were transplanted into the State Department, where they formed the backbone of the State Department's official post-war planning group. But that's getting ahead. I want to take seriously the period of the so-called phony war from September 1939 to May of 1940. Then the planners weren't sure what they wanted. They certainly didn't want to see Nazi Germany win the war, but they also feared a rapid victory by France and Britain that might result in an exclusive trading bloc that would exclude the United States. The military group within the council was led by Allen Dulles, and what they were doing in the spring of 1940 as the Nazis marched into Denmark and Norway is revealing. The group were painstakingly cataloging schemes for disarmament. They went back to the ancient Greeks who had prohibited poisoning wells. They went right up to Winston Churchill, who had suggested in 1913 a one-year holiday on naval building. And they summarized all this and put it in a memo and delivered it to the State Department on May 1st, 1940. In short, the post-war planners found themselves following old internationalist formula by default: promote intercourse, seek disarmament, but avoid political military entanglement in Eurasia. Then the Nazis invaded France. To the surprise of everyone, France fell within 6 weeks. Suddenly, Hitler was master of Europe and seemed likely to conquer Britain and the British Empire. Now, the American political class perceived a crisis. Congress quickly instituted the first ever draft in peacetime, and it approved a vast military buildup. But what was the crisis all about? It isn't easy to explain. Few observers believed North America faced much danger of being successfully invaded from across the Atlantic. And the US economy was so self-contained, especially after the Depression, that it didn't need much foreign trade. America, that is, remained safe and prosperous, as the historian John Thompson has argued, and I see him on the call today. But it wasn't just John Thompson who argued that. The post-war planners in the Council on Foreign Relations concluded the same thing. At the depths of the crisis in the summer of 1940, they assumed that henceforth the United States would be confined to its own hemisphere. In fact, only a quarter sphere extending from North America down to where Brazil juts out into the Atlantic and no further. This quarter sphere would be the area that the United States would trade in and defend militarily for the foreseeable future. And in crude material terms, there wasn't that much wrong with this. The economists Hansen and Viner concluded that the US economy could perform adequately within the quarter sphere. For that reason, some Americans believed the United States should build its military strength so they could guard the Western Hemisphere against any outside invasion. But it should not go any further. This was the view of a motley coalition of Americans who gathered under the banner of America First. The appeal of this position was significant. Secure between the oceans, the United States could remain at peace and cultivate within the Americas the basis of a safe and free world. The United States could thus continue its internationalist tradition of engaging with everyone, but avoiding power politics in the old world. By the autumn of 1940, however, as Britain withstood German bombing, FDR and other foreign policy elites began to make a different choice. To them, a hemispheric existence, however adequate, was not ideal. As internationalists, American elites expected to be able to trade and move across the globe on basically liberal terms. And as exceptionalists, they expected the United States would increasingly define world history. This was the problem. If the Axis powers were to rule Europe and Asia, or if another totalitarian power were ever to do the same in the future. America's territory might be safe, its economy might be sound, but it would be isolated from the world, isolated from history. FDR himself warned that if Hitler dominated Britain, America would become, quote, a lone island in a world dominated by the philosophy of force. Americans would become, FDR said, a people lodged in prison, handcuffed, hungry, and fed through the bars from day to day by the contemptuous, unpitying masters of other continents. Now, FDR was assuming that the United States would still be supreme in the Western Hemisphere and safe in North America, and yet he still said the United States would be rendered a passive sufferer, receiving world history rather than making it. The idea of isolation switched the goalposts. It implied that it was bad enough for the United States to be confined to the Western Hemisphere, even if secure and prosperous. Previously, internationalism, as it was known, had hinged on the assumption that peaceful intercourse would transcend force, but Hitler seemed to prove the opposite true. Intercourse depended on force. There could be no trade, no law, no order, except if defended by hegemonic force. The Council's planners put this insight into practice. In the 3 months after France fell, the economists undertook a monumental study at the request of the State Department to ask how much of the world did the United States really want for the future after the war. They began with the Western Hemisphere, and they kept adding new chunks of the globe. First, a Pacific region that included even Japan, and ultimately the rest of the British Empire. And what they wanted was to find a US-dominated area that would be more economically self-sufficient than a potential Axis-dominated Europe. So that way the United States would have the geopolitical and geoeconomic edge. And they also sought to minimize the governmental regimentation of trade. So the only way to get rid of trade imbalances would be to make the area bigger, to export surplus goods. So it's no surprise that the best way to fulfill these luxurious criteria was to make the area larger, until the planners concluded by the autumn that the United States must hold unquestioned power in the world, using, quote, its military power to protect the maximum possible area of the non-German world. This plan came to be known as the Grand Area. I don't want to overstate its importance, though, because I think it was only a somewhat more rigorous display of the kind of thinking that was happening more broadly. For example, publishing mogul Henry Luce proclaimed a start to the American century already in February 1941. That year, post-war planners developed detailed blueprints for the United States to exercise post-war dominance in an exclusive and close alliance with the British Empire, specifically the white settler dominions. As one of the planners put it, world order now required, quote, world domination by the United States and the British Empire. But as the Anglo-American Atlantic Charter was announced in August of 1941, the planners worried. Would the public refuse to shoulder the burdens of leadership? Would they find such a role un-American and un-internationalist? In short, US supremacy needed to be legitimated. And as the rest of my account documents, beginning at the end of 1941 and continuing to 1945, they hit upon a solution: reclaim the mantle of internationalism and international organization. Now they positioned US military supremacy as the epitome of internationalism, as opposed to this new category, isolationism. That way, armed dominance became the culmination of an American tradition. Second, post-war planners, having heaped scorn on world organization for the past several years, now they embraced it. Some kind of international body seemed essential for convincing the US public to accept world leadership. Because international organization symbolized the old aspiration to end power politics, it could become a vehicle to implement power politics. Thus, just after achieving victory over Japan in October of 1945, a new president, Harry Truman, could stand before Congress and proclaim as a matter of course, quote, "We must relentlessly preserve our superiority on land and sea and in the air." Let me just conclude briefly with some broad implications for the present. We can certainly talk more about this in the discussion. I think the wartime origins of armed primacy tell us something fundamental and paradoxical about US foreign policy today. On the one hand, America's commitment to global dominance easily outlasted the Cold War competition with Soviet communism. Global dominance had never been about a particular adversary. It was conceived as a long-term project grounded in the argument that a decent world order required armed enforcement, including to nip future aggressors in the bud. But here's the paradoxical part. Something has changed in the world since the 1940s. It isn't the lack of a great power rival per se, but rather the disappearance of totalitarianism as an alternative order, as a way of organizing international relations and exchanges across borders. The original case for primacy depended upon the specter of a totalitarian other that could corrupt liberal intercourse. But today that specter arguably doesn't exist. Communism died and stayed dead, or as in China, it rose again, but only by mutating into one-party state capitalism, which does a lot of business with the outside world and has so far engaged in little armed conquest across borders. In this kind of world, exactly why does the United States need to maintain military preeminence? This question now seems out in the open today when I think US global dominance faces a crisis of legitimacy at home. And I would suggest the way forward, or at least a start, lies in rejecting the advice of Henry Luce, who wrote in his that America, quote, "those old labels, internationalism and isolationism." As he wrote at the time, "We can make a truly American internationalism something as natural to us in our time as the airplane or the radio." And that's exactly what happened. Americans then and since then came to find their supremacy to be natural. They accepted that internationalism and isolationism were indeed the horizons of possibility in their foreign policy. My hope is that new generations will free themselves up to be more creative. So I will just leave it there and look forward to Stuart's comments and everyone's questions.
Thank you, Stephen. That was terrific. I think, having recently read the book, that was a terrific overview of what is a really important book, and a terrific review by Paul Kennedy, by the way, in the Wall Street Journal, if anybody's interested. My colleague Bob Jervis is here. I'm going to make sure I give him a chance to jump in. He's our fellow co-panelist. We're also going to extend the panel to 1:30 p.m. so we don't feel like we need to rush on any of these things. So let me just give a few quick points. I don't really take any issue with the story of the battle of ideas that Stephen brilliantly lays out in his book. And I agree that the fall of France in June 1940 was a monumental pivot point, leading to a flurry of activity, culminating with Pearl Harbor and everything that followed after that. But let me just give two really quick points. I want to get everyone else into this discussion soon. One point is on the ideas underpinning the big shift in 1940. And a more important point for policy discussions is the notion that the debate effectively ended in 1940 and early 1941. I believe the debate actually didn't resolve itself until exactly a decade later, not with the fall of France on June 25th of 1940, but with North Korea's invasion of South Korea on June 25th of 1950. That's exactly 10 years to the day from the fall of France. And there was a lot of history between those two June 25th. On the first ideas-based point, just a couple of quick ones. 1940 obviously was a titanic shift from America's traditional approach to the world. You know, it's 150 years as, for the most part, a reticent, if not reluctant, global player. But I'm going to slightly disagree with Stephen on the ideas. I believe the ideas underpinning the shift were not new at all in 1940. And they were part of the fabric of American discourse literally since the founding of the Republic in the 18th century. Stephen rightly flags Henry Luce's American Century, and he, deciphers it brilliantly in the book. His American Century article in February 1941, 10 months before Pearl Harbor, as one of the landmark public rallying cries for America's new dominant role in the world. And Stephen highlights a passage from the article that essentially overturns George Washington's great rule of avoiding, permanent alliances, or what Jefferson referred to as entangling alliances, by making the point, as Stephen said, that America would become too mighty to entangle. That gets around the problem of Washington's great rule. Luce said that the cure for a world of conflict and war was for America to, quote, exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit and by such means as we see fit, unquote. But this is not a new concept in American strategic thought. Stephen says that George Washington never called for an armed dominance of the world by the United States, but he envisioned the day when that would happen. And he said it in this very same farewell address. He said, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance, when belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation, when we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. In an earlier letter, he was even more blunt. He said that the United States would soon, quote, possess the strength of a giant and bid defiance to any earthly power whatsoever, unquote. Stephen also quotes Hamilton in Federalist 11, supposedly saying that America should keep its power limited to the Western Hemisphere and just seek to be, quote, ascendant in the system of American affairs, unquote, as Hamilton put it. But if you read a bit further down in that same paragraph in Federalist 11, Hamilton went on to say, quote, let Americans disdain to be the instruments of European greatness, exclamation. Let them erect one great American system superior to the control of all transatlantic force or influence and able to dictate the terms of the connection between the old and the new world, exclamation. That's 2 exclamation points in 2 sentences. There are only a dozen more in the entire 85 Federalist Papers. So Hamilton's point about America dictating the terms of world politics was something he felt strongly about. Even Thomas Jefferson, author of the famous words, quote, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none, envisioned the United States eventually in command of world affairs. A series of letters during and after the War of 1812 showed Jefferson convinced that America needed to be the most powerful nation in the world, and he believed it naturally would become that due to its exceptionalist political system, and it would need enough power to draft its own Treaty of Ghent, which the Europeans would be forced to abide. Again, America someday dictating its relations with the world as we see fit. Now, these views can be understood as part of the standard American unilateralism and limited foreign policy of the 19th century, but the underlying point was there, that the United States will eventually dictate the terms of world politics. What changed over time was exactly what Alexis de Tocqueville predicted in the 1830s, that America's unprecedented growth to power would make it simply, quote, wishful thinking, that America could stay, quote, could remain, quote, astride world politics. Instead, Tocqueville predicted the day would come when, quote, America's chief interests would be in daily connection with those of other powerful nations. By the turn of the 20th century, America's chief interests, primarily commercial, were deeply connected with those of other powerful nations. And America tried to sustain its aloof position, tried to remain astride world politics, as Stephen points out, transcending world politics. But it failed in the early 20th century multiple times. The United States was dragged into World War I, thanks to German submarine warfare and threats to the free seas and global commerce and potentially to the Western Hemisphere itself. That was a war where 20 million people died, including 115,000 Americans. America then experimented again with remaining astride world politics in the 1920s and 1930s, only to witness the rise of massive war machines in Europe and Asia, threatening everything. That was a war that led to 75 million dead, including 420,000 Americans. So yes, John Quincy Adams famously warned America to go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But in 1940, the United States was not searching for monsters. It was surrounded by them. And that was the impetus to finally heed the call of Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson to use its power to begin dictating its terms to the world. Second quick point, we have a bunch of IR scholars that I think could speak to this as well. My point is the early to mid 1940s was not the definitive moment for the US to go permanently all in as a dominant militarized global superpower. In fact, after World War II, there was a major strategic debate in the country, but it wasn't over isolationism, however you wanted to define it, or versus internationalism, however you want to define that. It was over America's traditional mobilization strategy versus a new and permanent deterrence strategy. For 150 years, the United States abided by this mobilization strategy, starting with the near war with France in 1800, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, even the Spanish-American War, and obviously World War I. The United States would temporarily mobilize and then swiftly pull back after the war was over and return to its favorite position as astride world politics. The problem after World War II was not Nazi Germany conquering France, it was now the rise of the Soviet threat. And the debates that took place between 1945 and 1950 was about should the United States return to its mobilization position or create a permanent deterrence position. And even with the passage of multiple important policies and initiatives in 1947, like the Truman Doctrine, the National Security Act, the Marshall Plan, the United States was demobilizing faster than any other country in history. It went from a 13 million man army to just over 1 million man army. In 1948, the Republican Congress was promising big tax cuts and promising even bigger cuts to the military to pay for them. So the debate over America's permanent militarized role in the world was absolutely not settled in 1940. It was actually debated pretty aggressively in the late 1940s. And only after two shocks to the system, the Soviet testing of the atomic bomb in September of 1949 and the Chinese Communist Revolution in October of 49, leading to NSC 68 in April of 1950. And in fact, NSC 68 had 4 options for US policy. So the US was still debating what to do. One of those options was called a return to isolationism. Other options were using the nuclear monopoly. Another option was a failing policy that they were using at the time, which was just to financially fund the Europeans. So they ended up going with the 4th option in NSC 68, which was a quote unquote permanent forwardly deployed role in the world to fight against Soviet communism. That was also dead on arrival. That was not going to be funded. That was unpopular. That was going nowhere until June 25th of 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, and that began what we now know as America's fully permanently deployed role in the world with the good and the bad. I'm going to agree with a lot of the critics. I'm just pointing out how that part in the world came to be. One final statistic, prior to the Korean War, the United States only had 2 permanent military bases around the world, one in the Philippines and one in Saudi Arabia. Just 15 years after the Korean War, the United States, I got this from Steve Sestanovich, the US had 450 military bases in 36 countries. So it was the Korean War that won the debate. And we could agree or disagree on whether that was the right move, but that's, I think, the lineage of America's transition from its 150 years of what some people call isolationism to its more permanent role ever since. I'm going to turn it over to Bob first, and then we'll open it up for some further discussion.
Thank you. Sorry to have missed about the first 5 or 10 minutes, but I can assure Stephen I've not only have the book, but as you see, marked it up a great deal. First, I'll come back to the points Stuart makes, and we haven't coordinated, but I agree with them, and I'll just want to reinforce them. But before I do, first, I think it is, as Stuart has said, really an extremely interesting book of you cover, really eye-opening for taking a new view of history we thought we understood, and for laying out, for opening up a lot of very important issues. It is, I think, a work of intellectual history, which is what Stuart, I think, is getting at. That is, you portray very well the change in attitudes of important segments of the American foreign policy elite, generally those outside the government. And I want to come back to that. And some of these figures are familiar to us at Columbia. James Shotwell, who was, I think now my colleague, Paige Fortna, is the Shotwell professor. Nicholas Murray Butler, the anti-Semitic president of Columbia and Nobel Peace Prize winner, very important people, and they come across in a different light. And although I think it's a tribute to the way you've written it, that although you're critical of a lot of what they said, you treat them with great respect, and there is no condescending hindsight in your views. So let me talk first a little about the intellectual history, and then about whether it explains US policy. One thing that's interesting, and you pointed out in the email to Stuart and Ingrid and the book earlier as a subject for discussion, is the views of the American internationalists before the war, in the 20s and 30s, which have, I think, not been fully explored. That is, was there a vision of world politics that was practical then, and more important, and obviously you're interested in this as the history, but you're interested in it in your role at the Quincy Institute and what this means for the current world. Is this a vision that could be applied today? And I want to raise two questions. One is the comparison with the British international, what are called British liberal internationalists. And I can see that, in a relatively short book, you couldn't bring it in, but it's particularly interesting because, as you know, and some of my IR colleagues know, in the last, 15, 20 years, there's been revisionism about the internationalists of the 20s and the 30s, and push back against the view of E.H. Carr that they were what he would call not internationalists, but idealists. And a bunch of scholars, mostly in the UK, have looked again at Norman Angell, who's often ridiculed and misunderstood for what he wrote before World War I, but his role after the war, Leonard Woolf, Arnold Toynbee, and many other quite important thinkers. And the point of this is the revisionists repaint these people as, if you will, more realist, to be crude. That is, they argue, and I think pretty convincingly, although I don't claim to have gone back and reread their writings, but they portray them convincingly as believing that force did have a quite significant role in world politics, as denying that there was a complete harmony of interests. They thought it was significant and that it could grow with greater international intercourse, but they were not, peace, drugs and or sex, drugs and rock and roll, as we ridiculed the views of the late 60s and 70s. Now, what I gather from what's interesting is that their counterparts, the American internationalists, seem in some ways, if I'm reading you right, as not as realist, with a capital R, that is not meaning to say who's right and wrong, but as more believing in the role of commerce and interchange by themselves producing world peace without, if you will, a hard infrastructure of power. So this raises the question, and I guess we'll stop this part, of the relationship between the American and British liberal internationalists in the 20s and 30s, who clearly communicated quite a bit with one another. So that's one. Second point of the partly intellectual history, but moving more into the politics that you mentioned, but I want to stress because I thought it was very important in the book. And I think probably largely correct. I think you may exaggerate a bit, but is the endorsement of international organization as a way of winning American public opinion. I think this is a very important argument, not only for our understanding of what's going on in the 40s and early 50s, but in general for the extent to which foreign policies, especially of democracies, but let's just limit them, is driven by the need to get domestic support. I think a lot of IR scholars simply underplay this, and I think leaders are always aware that public support over the long and medium run is both necessary but elusive and ephemeral. And when we think about general arguments, the Cold War, I think one problem with the so-called revisionist school is it implies that public opinion is easily manipulated by the elites, and the elites are confident they can do that. I think that's quite wrong, and I think what your book argues, and it shows is maybe not inappropriate, although there's still room for debate, is that they realized that this was going to be a long, hard slog, and that they needed to constantly work on developing public support. Now, it would be interesting to look more at what public opinion data and other things we have about the attitudes of the public and how it changed. Now I want to shift, I'll be through in about just a couple of minutes, really parallel to what Stuart was saying, the relationship between the intellectual history and the history of American foreign relations. And that there are two parts to this. One is that although I think you're right that the US government, especially the State Department, even the Pentagon, in this period, they're very underpowered organizations. The Pentagon is fine for fighting the war, that's what it's doing. But it isn't as though they've got hundreds of economists, political scientists, and people planning on the post-war. They can't, that isn't what they're geared up to do. And in fact, even now, as some of you know, a lot of the sort of planning for better and for worse is outsourced to the Beltway bandits, that the government simply does not have the personnel to do it. And So the outside groups of the Council on Foreign Relations and others, are really important, and their ideas are imported into the State Department, and sometimes the people are. But it's much harder. Your book doesn't talk about, and it doesn't mean to talk about, what's going on at the highest levels in the US government. Part of the problem is that FDR's circle is very small. And also figuring out what he's thinking is extraordinarily difficult. One of his associates referred to the impenetrable mind of FDR. He plays his cards very close. He tells different things to different people, even more than most leaders. So I think perhaps an unanswerable question, although historians have tried to answer it as they should, is what is FDR's vision? Frank Castiglione, in his marvelous book, which I disagree with in part, FDR's Lost Alliances, certainly stresses the extent to which he hoped for the big three, and that is Britain, Soviet Union, and the US, and as Stuart said, a real withdrawal of the US from areas outside of the Western Hemisphere. And his view of the role of force in the post-war order, I think remains muddy, and I suspect was muddy in his own mind. I mean, academics try to look ahead, but politicians and political leaders look ahead as little as possible because what they have to deal with tomorrow is so pressing. So I think if we could bring FDR back to life and make him honest to impossible things and ask him what his view of force in the post-war world, he would say, well, we're going to see how it evolves. But still, I think that the more political aspects, which are FDR and Sumner Welles, who of course is involved very heavily until he's forced out, those linkages are unclear. And then finally, and Stuart said all this very well, so I'll be very brief, that what happened after 45, I think, is driven very heavily by world events. Now, I grant that they're not determinate, and that this goes back to the level of analysis problem Ken Waltz laid out in Man, the State, and War, the relative influence of decision makers, the role versus the role of domestic sources of foreign policy versus the external environment. And obviously they interact in complex ways. But I don't think that in 1945, the US was inevitably set on the path it had followed. Public opinion certainly had great faith in the United Nations, and this complicated Truman's policy enormously, and had great hesitancy on playing a large role abroad. That even the Marshall Plan, which we now take for granted as very important in the rebuilding of Europe, now whether it was responsible for the Iron Curtain, different issue, but anyway, which we think is sort of obviously what the US should have done, I don't think would have been implemented at the level it was without various things the Soviet Union did in East Europe. The Czech, would we have had NATO really without the Czech coup? I'm doubtful. And I agree with Stuart. In fact, I've written 40 years ago, my God, an article on the Korean War as a crucial turning point. And Stuart is right, NSC 68 was adopted before the Korean War. And although we all know of its hair-raising or perhaps stomach-turning rhetoric, that Truman sent it out to be costed out and was in the process of cutting the budget. So I think when we look at what happened, and you don't claim, I think you imply but don't claim, and we'll see that because of this almost set like railroad tracks, it was inevitable. And that I would disagree with, maybe, but I think you could say it made it possible, which is not at all trivial. The interesting counterfactual history would be, we take Soviet behavior and as the same from 45 on, and we take very different American history from 40 to 45. Where do we go? I think that is interesting. And certainly, of course, for what, we're all concerned about the history for its own sake, but also for the question, stop is the one we raised, what are the alternatives now? Because the fact that after the Cold War, America basically continued a great, well, I don't want to say continued all of its policies, did maintain all of its alliances. Remember, Ken Waltz initially, as a realist, said, end of Cold War, end of NATO. He later said, wait a minute, I've got a realist explanation for why that didn't happen, but his initial reaction was no need for that. We have more alliances and now more bases than we had in the Cold War. That striking continuity, I think, does owe at least something to the intellectual foundations that were laid down in the 40s. So let me stop, and Stuart can now, I see we've already got at least one hand.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Just real quick, Bob or Stephen, the question of what was in FDR's mind, and I don't know the answer to this. Bob or Stephen might know the Stark memo in 1940. My understanding was that FDR and Cordell Hull were not big on the Stark memo, that they were not really envisioning that type of an American militarized, replacing the British balance of power kind of role in 1940 and thereafter. Bob, do you know FDR's view of the Stark memo, just out of curiosity?
Didn't catch the end. His view of what?
Oh, his view of the Stark memo, Plan Dog,
I think, and there may be others on your more expertise. Yeah, I think he was fully on board with that. And indeed, I remember the origins, but certainly I think was deeply involved with that.
You want to jump in and just do a response to anything Bob had to say before we open it up?
Sure. First of all, so many rich comments from both of you, Stuart and Bob, and I'm really grateful to hear them. I also don't want to address all of them because I want to give others a chance to speak, and I'm sure there'll be some opportunities to connect your comments with questions that will be raised. I just on the Stark memo, I do, and the issue of FDR more generally, I consciously avoided trying to read FDR's mind. I felt that, first of all, that was an extremely difficult task. And as Bob suggested, his mind contains multitudes and therefore to some degree is unknowable. It also had been done by many historians or attempted by many historians in the past and currently, and that's certainly a worthy goal. But what if I have an interpretation of FDR, I think it's that I find him not terribly interesting relative to other scholars, that I think it's really interesting to look at this kind of second tier of people who dedicated themselves to thinking about the international order and America's role in it, and who went on to have terribly important roles in American policymaking, either during the war or after World War II. And so, I find FDR essentially to be moving with them in the main, even if we could debate, the different bands where we might imagine FDR is entertaining his own position. His issuance of the Atlantic Charter, his first conception of the 3 or 4 policemen as the basis of post-war order, and then he's convinced by Sumner Welles, I think, to accept an international organization on the condition that it will provide scope for the United States to exercise leadership without being very constrained, and especially to provide legitimacy in the American political system for such a role for the United States. He seems to be pretty much in line with where the post-war planners whom I give more sustained attention to were. And for me, that's enough. That's enough because I'm interested in understanding, not so much the wartime decision-making or even the kind of specific policies that are set up. I don't say much, for example, about, the post-war planning for the reconstruction of Germany, Japan, et cetera. So that's why I took the approach that I did. I also just want to concede, essentially, I agree fully that the Korean War and the adoption, the related adoption of NSC 68 does, I think, complete the process of the adoption of American primacy as we know it, that I think is set in motion in the middle of 1940. I did make a conscious choice, though, not just for reasons of length, to stop in 1945. I think many people are really familiar with this progression from 1945 into the early 1950s. And there's an interesting debate about, when did American grand strategy become unrestrained, let's say, or and of course, George Kennan plays a role. And so what I wanted to show is that, I would agree that what was in place by the consensus that was in place by 1945 did not necessarily make the Cold War as we know it inevitable, and the Soviet Union, the Soviet actions play a crucial role in bringing that about. I do think it was, as Bob helpfully suggested, at least a condition of possibility, possibly more. I'm still thinking it through, but at least a condition of possibility. And again, for me, that's enough. It's very significant that, as of 1945, American officials and intellectuals were not saying that what they wanted to do was return to a kind of non-entanglement position vis-a-vis Europe and Asia, which was very plausibly they could have done based on tradition, based on American interests, and so forth. But instead, they were, accepting in principle that the United States had a basic responsibility to enforce world order. Clearly, the United States was the dominant power, and the kind of geographical separation between the New World and the Old that Stuart alluded to in both of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton's comments, which, I think I would disagree slightly about interpreting them. They still contained a constitutive separation between the New World and the Old, and at most called for the United States to be in a commanding position so that the Old World did not encroach on American prerogatives that had been thoroughly trounced by 1945. And then the question became, what the United States should do about Soviet power. in which there were various options that might have been entertained. But, I think without the 1940-41 transformation, and it's an intellectual transformation that is experienced, in a generalizable way, we cannot allow, this is the nature of the international system. There are these totalitarian conquering powers, and they cannot be allowed to hold hegemony in Europe and Asia. And even in 1940 and 41, all the concepts that go into the later Cold War and are attached to the Soviet Union are formulated. The Free World Association, for example, comes into existence in 1941. Indeed, the kind of post-war outcome with a projected Nazi Europe is a kind of Cold War. There's an anticipation of a tense armed stalemate. That's the Cold War. It's all there. So that entire conceptual apparatus and redefinition of America's interests and role in the world happen and then end up being applied to the Soviet Union later in the 1940s. If that's all you want to take from the book, in other words, in terms of understanding the subsequent process, I can live with that. So with that, I'll be happy to open it up to questions.
Great. People that I see in video, if you just want to do one of these, I can, call you, or you can use the blue hand raise, whatever anybody would like to do. I know there's a lot of esteemed colleagues in these boxes, so just give me a signal, any of you, if you'd like to jump in. I know there's a lot to talk about. Don't be shy.
The participants.
Oh, Stephen Biddle, please.
Okay. Yeah, I'd just like to push you a little harder on your response to Stuart and Bob Jervis on this question of post-war demobilization. Right. So certainly, I mean, I haven't read the book. I read the New York Times op-ed version. I will read the book, but I have not read it yet. But certainly the general thrust of the way the book is described in the op-ed is the United States has been a hegemonic power for a long time, and it started sooner than you, dear reader, think. It started in 1940. If we are a non-status quo power-seeking gain from 1940, how then does one square a massive demobilization? If what we're after is global armed supremacy, how does a prospective globally armed supreme power justify taking a massive military force that would give you what you seek and then sending it all home until you then get scared again by some new event, qua Stuart and Bob's analysis? Similarly, I was wondering if you could clarify your view on just exactly what you see U.S. intent as being, right? So one way you could read this same set of historical events is that the United States throughout the period of interest, and I'm not taking a position on this, but you could read this as being the United States throughout the period of interest is primarily interested in peaceful intercourse. The trouble is it decides in 1940 that you can't get peaceful intercourse if the United States remains aloof and allows the global economy to be dominated by hostile powers that will leave the United States, as you quoted FDR, hungry and being fed through bars, right? Which doesn't sound to me like an expansionist power seeking to seize the world economy. It sounds to me like a status quo power that wants peaceful interaction, that's worried that it will be denied it if the United States stands back and does nothing. And 1940 is in many ways sort of an odd moment for a state to suddenly decide this is the opportunity to go gain. This is the opportunity to expand our ambitions. Potential global hegemons are now ascendant in Europe and Asia. Britain is fighting alone against Germany. The Royal Navy might come into German possession if Britain falls. The two moats that people have been persuaded of in the past, many American thinkers at the time assumed that they were important moats because the Royal Navy was keeping them safe for us. We were free riding on the Brits in important ways prior to World War II. The Royal Navy could end up flying a German flag by 1941 if a reasonable person looks forward and just imagines, where is this war going? Last but not least, the issue of the UN in the context of this. So if the United States is seeking global armed supremacy, and if the UN is simply a device to buy off the American domestic public to get them to buy into this expansionist, ambitious project, there are many ways you could design a UN that would serve that minimalist purpose. Why design it in a way that hands veto power to 4 other states, many of which you could reasonably suppose might be hostile to this US project, especially like, the Soviet Union. I mean, the alternative model of all this is the one that Stuart and Bob were presenting, right? That the United States remains essentially interested in peaceful intercourse throughout this period, but decides that that is threatened by outside powers, and twice with a gap in between, decides reluctantly that it has to mobilize simply to protect the opportunity for peaceful intercourse, not to expand US control or to expand US global ambitions in some way.
Terrific. Okay, so let me pick right up on that part. I don't, I don't seek to characterize in the book. I mean, the book is, for a book that's fairly polemical, it's also written with a kind of a light touch in terms of making judgments on the actors and whether the United States is defensive, offensive, aggressive, or not. That was intentional. I think you could fairly read it in different ways. So yes, the United States is seeking a longstanding goal in 1940 and 41 to preserve peaceful intercourse. But it does come to a new conclusion about what's required to do that, which is paradoxically that armed force, overwhelming armed force, is required to do that in a world of totalitarian conquest, so that it's not the totalitarians who are organizing intercourse, which will then become, by definition, not peaceful. Is that, furthermore, the intercourse valued wasn't intercourse that's clearly tied to the strength of the US economy, or even that of the Western Hemisphere. It became detached from a geographical referent. To a degree, it had already become detached from a geographical referent, and for some internationalists prior to 1940, but it really firmly did by the end of 1940. So, whether that is, I think that there's innovation there, on a conceptual level, and in terms of what kind of role America would then need to play in the world to preserve what you might say in a sense is a traditional goal of a world of basically peaceful and liberal intercourse. And so, what I find significant, rather than me judging, I think this is aggressive or not, what I find significant is how the post-war planners themselves, the people actually wrestling with this issue, they found what they were doing to be a striking departure from what they had been doing just before. They seemed to be concerned about the extent, well, some of them welcomed it, but they were pretty explicit about, some of them, this is a basically offensive kind of military role in the world that we're envisioning, in partnership with, the British Empire, which we have not traditionally said is a force for peace or free intercourse. So I think, if all I can do is to get people to appreciate the kind of tragic nature of this decision making and choice, that again I think is extremely valuable.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve and Stephen. John Thompson, and then James Boyle.
Hello, thank you. Stephen is familiar with quite a lot of what I'm about to say, I think, but I want to try to suggest ways in which we can reconcile Stephen's perspective and yours, Stuart, and Bob's as well. And I think perhaps it might be helpful to separate some of the adjectives from the nouns. Global dominance, military supremacy, and the rest of it. I agree with Stephen. It seems to me it's his contribution to point out that the American foreign policy elites blinked and took a new view about the role of force in world affairs as a consequence of the events of particularly 1940. But what I want to suggest is that the earlier, what the change was from was a period in which American policymakers and elite Americans generally, and in fact, the American population to a large extent generally, had an assumption of kind of American dominance. I mean, I've written about World War I particularly, but Wilson was extremely confident that if America joined the League of Nations, it would sort of boss it around. And I think the key date, and this is where I slightly disagree with Stuart, from his very early quotes from Washington and Hamilton and the rest. To me, the key date is, or it's not so much a date as a period, is the one that Stephen alluded to briefly, which is when the United States becomes the leading economic power and leading financial power in the world, which is the late 19th century. And by the outbreak of World War I, it is a superpower in economic terms compared to the European countries. And that was demonstrated and I think American policymakers, the American elite generally, knew that in their bones. And they had a kind of assumption that America would be dominant in the world. And what changed was the sense of the means by which it was so. And I think it's an interesting way in which we can compare the situation with the present again, really, is whether this confidence in America's economic dominance, which is really, I think, central for the last century or more, is now beginning to be doubted. Sorry, that's more a statement than a question, but I'll just throw it in.
Sure. It's a good extrapolation on what we were discussing. Absolutely. Stephen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's great to see you, John. I think this gives me an opportunity to talk about sort of what I take as the baseline for the transformation that I'm claiming. And so if we take the case of Woodrow Wilson and World War I think there's no question Woodrow Wilson is one of the, strongest, purest examples of an American exceptionalist that there is. And the United States had long been committed to a certain vision of American dominance that I think is part of the ideology of exceptionalism. But Wilson has it in spades, and he certainly takes, I think it's fair to narrate, as John does, this transformation as one with more increments. And I don't want to deny, the long history of American expansion, quite dramatic and steady expansion from the founding, to World War I and then beyond. However, let me note that even Woodrow Wilson, in his public pitch for the League of Nations, says that the point of the League of Nations is to put public opinion and its power behind international politics. Force, he argued, was supposed to be in the background, so much so that when he tried to explain what Article 10 was about to the Senate, he suggested that it was binding in conscience only. And so if the Congress somehow didn't want to go to war in support of Article 10, somehow that was all right. I think Woodrow Wilson didn't want to confront the very real possibility that, in fact, the League of Nations would end up being a vehicle for war, not an alternative to it. And indeed, when it turns out in actual history that, as the 1930s come about, that the League of Nations, if it's to mean much of anything, is to put pressure on other states and be essentially a vehicle for sanctions, economic, military, thus warfare, the supporters of the League of Nations in the United States go into disarray and divide terribly, and the League loses incredible support because for many of its supporters, the whole point was to transcend the need to go to war, not to come up with a new scheme to put the United States into war. So Woodrow Wilson, I think, was doing, he was certainly moving the United States toward primacy in a certain sense, but he has a really idealistic internationalist vision that remains to be grappled with. And that's why a lot of his own devotees in the interwar period go in very different directions. Some of them oppose US entry into World War II through the 1930s. And so it's a really complex story. And ultimately we have to explain whatever our views of, the main contours of American expansion, from the founding onward, why in the 1930s there's such a vibrant peace movement, so much reluctance to get involved in fighting in Asia and a looming war in Europe, and then an America First movement ultimately that puts forward a coherent, credible and pretty popular vision for how the United States can relate to the world that just loses out, but has a real claim to be in line with American tradition. And so, I think there's a good case to be made that was never going to win out. It was never quite an even fight between the America Firsters or those who favored all aid to the Allies / intervention in the war / American post-war dominance. And yet, there's a big loss, I think, after that moment of the kinds of internationalist and nationalist appeals, including a non-entanglement tradition, coming into the post-45 period and in the present. It's just not really acceptable to be saying the kinds of things that were commonplace prior to 1941. All right, I'll leave that question there.
Thanks, Stephen. We're on almost a 10-minute warning here. We're going to go with James Boyle, please, if you can video up. Thank you.
Dr. Wertheim, I read your book recently and I loved it. Thanks for writing it. Like Dr. Jervis said, I think it's possible to read your book as an intellectual history, a history of ideas and how these ideas have morphed throughout history and taken hold in the American mind. In the book, you discuss a process of elite transmission in which interventionist internationalism took hold in the American mind by casting its opponent, non-interventionist internationalism, as isolationism, and by using international organization as an instrument to win public opinion for armed supremacy. So I wanted to ask if you could possibly describe a process today by which pre-World War II internationalism, with its ideas about mutual equality of nations, international law, peaceful and liberal exchange of ideas and commerce, a reinvigoration of diplomacy, and a consequent reduction in defense budgets might now take hold in America. Because it seems like power politics, a recasting of China as an aspirant to global hegemony, and global armed supremacy, as unfortunate as it is, they now seem pretty deeply ingrained in our thinking. So I would just ask you if you could possibly describe that process, how that could work today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I guess this is where I say I'm a historian, and so I don't know. But I guess I'm not just a historian anymore, so I can't punt. I hesitate to think that one can just reverse engineer the story that I've told. In part, it relied upon a very surprising international event. And I would hate to see, if there was an analog today that might force discipline and retrenchment suddenly for the United States, it would surely be something that I wouldn't want to see. It would be, for example, U.S. allied commitments, perhaps in one or two places simultaneously, tested, a bluff being called, and the costs of American dominance becoming very apparent very quickly to political leaders and the American public in a way that wasn't apparent to them. So I worry about that, especially if the United States continues to tout great power competition as the basis of its foreign policy, and I would say, clings to as much primacy as possible in a world that's clearly evolving from the unipolar moment, which was indeed a moment, aptly named, in fact, of the 1990s. My hope is that, in a more careful way, the United States will make prudent, responsible adjustments to its foreign policy and avoid a situation like that like a kind of sudden catastrophe from occurring. But then you have to ask the question that you asked, which is how to affect that kind of change absent a dramatic event. I mean, we're living through the pandemic. I've retreated to West Virginia this week, and Stuart's holding up his stuffed coronavirus, which is still weirding me out. Thank you, Stuart. That didn't seem to do it, even though, you know, exactly how much protection against a killer of so far 400,000 Americans did, you know, American global hegemony get it in this crisis. So that doesn't seem to have done the trick. So you have to wonder, but I am hoping that at least through, given the kind of mounting structural pressures the United States faces, both international and domestic, that at least the pressure will be on the United States and its policymaking class to have more discipline in its relations with the rest of the world. And, you know, issues like climate change, for example, as well as pandemic disease, I think clearly call for a very different prioritization for American national security. So if you've got better ideas than anything I've said or can come up with, please let me know.
Will do. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You know, I think that's a really good point to end our panel on. We're well over time, but I wanted to get everybody in who had questions. I thought that was really terrific. I want to thank Stephen, Bob, thanks for joining, all my colleagues that I see that came to participate, Ingrid, Ray, thanks for running the event, really well done. And Stephen particularly, this was a terrific panel. It really just elucidated some really important points, and let's all try to keep the conversation going. I'm going to have a side conversation with Bob about the Stark memo in a little while, but some great points to raise into the future. So thanks everybody, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.